The changes to Medicare's policies were bound to affect millions, but for John, it felt like a personal attack. At 52, John had lived with heart disease for years, managing it with a carefully balanced cocktail of medications that kept him alive, albeit in a somewhat grumpy, middle-aged man way. He was comfortable with his routine. Wake up, take his meds, grumble about the price of his prescriptions, and move on with his day. Life was manageable, if a little predictable, until one day the letter arrived. And with it, his carefully constructed world was thrown into chaos. John opened the letter from Medicare, expecting to see the usual annual update, maybe a reminder to update his address or some other administrative nonsense. Instead, the first sentence of the letter hit him like a heart attack, but, thankfully, not the kind he was used to. Due to recent policy changes under President Trump's new healthcare reforms, several medications, including those critical to your heart condition, will no longer be covered. John blinked twice. Then he reread the sentence. And then he had a moment of clarity, a moment where he thought, I didn't sign up for this. No warning, no, hey, John, by the way, things are going to suck for you now. Just a stark, impersonal letter telling him that the very medications keeping him alive would no longer be covered. His first instinct was to laugh. Not because it was funny, but because it was so absurd. He half expected the letter to say, oh, and by the way, you can also kiss goodbye to your dignity and possibly your ability to pay for groceries. Have a nice day, he imagined calling Medicare, only to hear a robot voice, press 1 if you'd like to file for bankruptcy. Press 2 if you'd like to cry in your car. Press 3 if you'd like to speak to an actual human being, though we can't guarantee that person will be helpful, but there was no time for humor. He needed those meds, and the price was about to skyrocket. John had been through enough in life to know that the world didn't care about his health. It cared about his wallet. And right now, his wallet was having a minor panic attack. He slumped down in his chair, clutching the letter in his hands. He thought about his doctor's office, where he had spent so many hours, trying to make sure his heart didn't decide to take a permanent vacation. He had been diligent, he took his meds on time, ate, mostly, well, and even tried to get some exercise, though tried was the key word there. But now, it seemed like he was being punished for his persistence. He imagined calling up his doctor's office to ask for advice, only to hear, sorry, John, but your heart doesn't come with a refund policy anymore. You're going to have to pay full price. And what about all those copayments he had faithfully paid for years? Were they just poof gone with the policy change? Probably. Nothing in life is as reliable as those two things, death and taxes, and now, apparently, costly medication. John sighed, rubbing his temples. He could already hear his inner monologue starting up, as it always did when life threw him a curveball. Well, John, looks like it's time to get creative. Maybe I can sell some of my extensive collection of action figures on eBay. Or start a GoFundMe titled, Help John's Heart Stay Beating. Literally, he let out a dry chuckle, the sound of it not quite matching the worry gnawing at him. His health wasn't some joke to be passed off with sarcasm. No, this was serious. He could try to find cheaper alternatives, but the reality was clear. Unless he wanted to take out a second mortgage on his house, his heart might just give up before the end of the month. And yet, John found himself strangely calm in that moment. Sure, the future was uncertain, and his financial stability was hanging by a thread, but he had learned one thing after all these years: life had a way of throwing curveballs, and the best thing he could do was keep swinging, even if he had no idea what was coming next. Well, he said to the empty room, looks like it's time to find a new way to keep this old heart ticking. Then, with a small smirk, he added, and maybe I'll start that GoFundMe after all. The days after John received the letter from Medicare were a blur of phone calls, research, and trying to keep his stress levels at a minimum. The shock had worn off, but the reality of his situation had settled in like a persistent ache in his chest, no pun intended. The first task at hand was figuring out exactly how much his medication would now cost without the support of Medicare's assistance. And that, John quickly realized, was going to be a journey of its own. He called up his pharmacy, hopeful that they might have some clarity, but his optimism quickly faded when the friendly, automated voice on the other end told him, "Please hold for the next available representative." A few minutes later, a voice that could have belonged to someone at the DMV picked up. "Hi, this is Carol, how can I help you today?" She asked, sounding like she'd been through this 1,000 times before. "I just got this letter from Medicare, and it says some of my prescriptions won't be covered anymore. Can you tell me how much these meds will cost without insurance?" John asked, trying to keep his voice steady. There was a brief pause before Carol's voice came back, now a little softer, like she was preparing to tell him something he wouldn't like. "Sir, the cost of your medication without coverage will be approximately $300 per month. That's for your heart medication alone." John did the math quickly in his head. $300 a month. That was more than his entire grocery bill in a month. Wait, $300 for each prescription? John asked, his voice rising slightly. "No, sir, that's just for the heart medication," Carol responded, unfazed by his reaction. "You have a few other prescriptions, don't you?" John could feel his blood pressure spiking, but he forced himself to stay calm. "Yes, I do." "So that means, yeah, we're talking well over $500 for the entire month without insurance," Carol finished for him. John stared at the phone for a moment, taking in the numbers. His hands were sweating, and a small laugh escaped from him. It wasn't funny, but in that moment, what else could he do? He could either laugh or cry, and laughing seemed like the better option. Okay. "Thanks, Carol," John said, then hung up, not sure if he was angry, relieved, or just overwhelmed. But the worst part of it wasn't just the $500 a month for medication, it was the crushing realization that he couldn't afford it. His pension barely covered the basics. His rent, utilities, groceries. The thought of spending half of it on medication made him feel like he was trapped in an ever-shrinking cage. John walked around his house, his mind racing. What options did he have left? He couldn't exactly walk into the pharmacy and ask for a discount. And even if he could, how much would that really save him in the long run? He thought about cutting back on some of his other expenses. He could stop going to the doctor for routine checkups, but that could backfire terribly. Maybe he could stop using his air conditioner in the summer. Or, he could. No, he couldn't do that. That was ridiculous. In the end, John found himself in front of his television, flipping through channels, not really watching anything. He was trying to distract himself from the reality of his situation. The rising cost of medication was bad enough, but knowing he would have to choose between his health and his ability to pay for other essentials like food, rent, or his electric bill was a nightmare. His mind started to wander. Replaying past decisions, times when he thought he had planned well, when he thought he had saved enough for a peaceful retirement. But now, with Medicare no longer covering his meds, it felt like his entire future had been yanked out from under him, and as he sat there in his worn-out chair, staring at the flickering screen, John realized that he wasn't just fighting against rising medication costs, he was fighting against a system that had left him with few choices. The very system that was supposed to protect people like him was now pulling away the safety net he had relied on for so long. He glanced at his phone, the list of medications he'd just typed out still on the screen. He could feel his chest tightening, but there was nothing left to do but face the facts. He was on his own. For the first time in a long time, John truly wondered how much longer he could keep this up. The phone call from the pharmacy was just the beginning. After receiving the shocking news about the cost of his medications, John spent the rest of the afternoon pacing around his apartment, trying to make sense of it all. He tried calling a few different pharmacies, hoping for a different price, but each time, the cost remained the same, as if they were all reading from the same script. By the time he hung up the last call, John felt like he had aged 10 years in one day, but that wasn't the worst of it. As the days went by, the reality of his situation began to sink in. John wasn't just facing higher medical costs. His finances were becoming more strained by the minute. The bills that once seemed like a manageable nuisance now felt like an avalanche coming straight for him. And the worst part? He didn't even know where to start digging out. he stared at his credit card statement on the kitchen counter. The balance was creeping up, and there was no way he could pay it off this month. He'd already borrowed from it more than he'd ever been comfortable with, but now, the total seemed to mock him. To make matters worse, his car's engine light had come on earlier that week, which meant a trip to the mechanic, and another bill he couldn't afford. John thought about his car for a moment. He had always been a proud owner of a reliable, albeit aging, sedan. It had been with him through thick and thin, but now, just like everything else in his life, it seemed to be on the verge of falling apart. Maybe it was time to sell it, he thought. But then again, without a car, how would he get to the doctor? How would he manage his groceries? The small, everyday logistics of life felt like a giant knot tightening around his chest. Then, the mail arrived, and with it, another slap in the face. It was from the power company. A reminder that his electricity bill was due in 3 days. It wasn't a huge bill, but when you were already scraping by, every little charge felt like it would topple everything. He opened it slowly, praying for a small miracle that might show a discount or a payment extension, but no such luck. The due date remained the same, and the amount was exactly what he expected, too much. In a moment of frustration, John picked up the letter and crumpled it in his hand, throwing it onto the table. "This is insane," he muttered to himself. "How am I supposed to make this work?" He stood up and walked over to the kitchen window, staring out at the view of the city skyline that he had always taken for granted. The world outside seemed so busy and so untouchable. And yet here he was, stuck in this mess of paperwork, medications, and mounting bills, watching his future slip further out of his grasp with each passing day. The sound of a knock on the door broke his thoughts. John turned, half expecting it to be a delivery or a neighbor asking for something. But when he opened it, he was greeted by a man in a suit. "Hello, Mr. Matthews, I'm here to remind you that your rent is overdue. We've given you ample notice, but I'm afraid we can't extend the deadline any longer." John's stomach sank as he looked at the man. He had been doing everything he could to keep up with the rent, but with the recent surge in his medical costs, he had fallen behind. The anxiety that had been building in him for days came to a head in that moment, and he felt his chest tighten, his heart racing in panic. I'm working on it," John stammered, trying to keep his voice steady. "I'll have it by next week. Just give me a little more time." The landlord's face remained neutral, almost clinical. "I'm afraid we can't give you any more time. You'll have to pay in full, or we'll have to take legal action." John felt his legs go weak. "Legal action?" He repeated the words as though they didn't quite register. What did that even mean? Eviction? Court fees? The mere thought of it sent a wave of dizziness over him. "Look, I've been a good tenant for 5 years, John said, desperation creeping into his voice. "I've always paid on time, but this is out of my control. I'm dealing with some medical stuff, and it's all piling up." The landlord seemed unmoved. "I understand, but that's not my problem. I suggest you figure it out quickly." With that, he turned and walked away, leaving John standing in his doorway, feeling like the walls were closing in on him. He closed the door slowly, his hands shaking. He could feel the weight of everything pressing down on him, the meds, the bills, the looming threat of eviction, and for the first time in his life, John wasn't sure how he was going to get out from under it all. The tension in the apartment seemed to grow thicker as the evening wore on. John knew he needed to act fast, but there was a part of him that felt paralyzed, as though any decision he made would only make things worse, and yet, there was one more thing he had to do, the hardest part. He had to call his daughter. She had been trying to help, offering to send money, but John hated asking. He didn't want to burden her, didn't want to admit that his life had spiraled so far out of control. But he also knew he couldn't keep pretending everything was fine. As the phone rang, John prepared himself for the inevitable, the moment when he would have to admit that his carefully constructed world had fallen apart. John sat in his worn-out armchair, staring at the phone in his hand, as if waiting for it to ring with an answer he didn't want. He had spent the past hour pacing around the apartment, trying to muster the courage to dial his daughter's number. The pressure was suffocating. He could feel the weight of his financial troubles, his health deteriorating, and now the looming threat of eviction all crashing down on him. But the hardest part was knowing that the one person he never wanted to burden, his daughter, would have to be the one to help him. With a deep breath, John tapped the screen, his fingers trembling slightly. It only took a few rings before his daughter, Megan, answered. "Hey, Dad, what's up?" she said cheerfully, though John could tell from the tone in her voice that she was busy with something. "Megan, I need to talk to you," John said, his voice rough, not entirely from the cold air, but from the lump in his throat that had been forming for the last few hours. It's about the rent and the medication. I don't know what to do." There was a pause on the other end. Megan's usual upbeat tone dropped, and John could almost hear the shift as she processed the words. "What happened, Dad? Is everything okay?" she asked, her voice thick with concern. John took another deep breath, feeling his chest tighten. "Medicare isn't covering my medications anymore. The costs have skyrocketed, and I don't have enough to cover them. Plus, the rent's overdue, and I just got a warning that they might evict me if I don't pay up." John tried to keep his voice steady, but it cracked near the end. He hated sounding so vulnerable, so helpless. "Oh my God, Dad, why didn't you tell me sooner?" Megan's voice was sharp now, a mix of anger and frustration, though it wasn't directed at him. "I thought you were doing okay with everything. I can't believe they're doing this to you." John felt a rush of guilt. "I didn't want to worry you. You've got your own life, your own stuff to deal with. I didn't want to be a burden." Megan sighed deeply on the other end. "Dad, you're not a burden. But this is ridiculous. We need to find a way to fix this. You can't keep living like this." John's heart sank. He knew she was right, but he couldn't shake the feeling that nothing could be fixed. He had worked hard his whole life. And now, in his later years, he was drowning in bills, poor health, and a system that seemed to be failing him. His pride had always been his shield, but it had started to crack under the weight of everything. "I'm just tired, Megan," he admitted, his voice barely above a whisper. "I'm tired of fighting for everything. I've been doing it for so long, and now it feels like nothing I do matters. I can't keep up with the bills, and I don't know what's going to happen if I don't get these meds." There was a long silence on the other end, and John braced himself for the inevitable. He didn't want to ask for money, not from her, but the reality was sinking in. He might have no other choice. "I'll help you, Dad," Megan said quietly, her voice softer now. "I'll send you what I can, but you've got to let me know exactly what you need. We'll figure this out together, okay?" John's heart twisted. He had always tried to be the strong one, the provider, but now he was asking his daughter for help. It felt like a failure, but at the same time, it was a lifeline. "Thank you, Megan," John said, the words thick in his throat. "I don't know what I'd do without you." After a few more moments of talking through the specifics of what he needed, how much for the rent, the medications, and a few essentials, Megan promised she would send some money right away and that they'd figure out a longer-term plan. But for now, John felt a small glimmer of relief. At least, for the moment, he wouldn't have to worry about losing his apartment, but the relief didn't last long. As soon as he hung up, the reality of his situation hit him all over again. His health was still deteriorating, and even though his daughter was helping, there was no guarantee the help would last forever. He had no control over the changes that had been forced on him, no say in the decisions that affected his life. All he could do was try to get by day, doing whatever it took to survive. As John shuffled to the bathroom to take his medication, he stared at the pill bottles lined up on the counter. The prices on the labels seemed to mock him, a cruel reminder of how much he had to pay just to stay alive. He swallowed the pills, hoping they would do what they were meant to. But the bitter taste lingered in his mouth. Nothing seemed to be working anymore, and as he looked at his reflection in the bathroom mirror, John realized that he wasn't just battling a disease, he was battling a system that made it harder for people like him to survive, to thrive. It wasn't just the physical pain anymore. It was the constant weight of the choices he was being forced to make, the constant fear that, one day, he might not be able to keep up. And no matter how many pills he took, it felt like that fear was the one thing he couldn't escape. The days after John's phone call with Megan passed slowly, like trudging through thick mud. He couldn't shake the weight of everything pressing down on him, the looming bills, the medications he could barely afford, and the fear that his health was slipping away, just like the little bit of stability he had left. For the first time in his life, he was caught in the middle of a battle he felt powerless to win. He had just paid what little he could to his landlord, still several $100s short of the full amount, and that nagging thought in the back of his mind persisted: how long can I keep doing this? The power bill still loomed, and now there was the added worry that if he didn't get the medication soon, his condition would worsen. His doctor had warned him that not taking his medication regularly would lead to more serious complications, but right now, it was the cost of survival that threatened to take him down first. The stress had started to wear on John physically. His chest felt tight, and his sleep was restless. Every time he closed his eyes, his mind raced with worries. What if I lose my home? What if the pills stop working? What if I can't keep up with the payments? The cycle of fear was endless. One morning, after a restless night of sleep, John woke up feeling more drained than usual. He knew the medications were supposed to help, but now they just felt like another thing he had to worry about. Even taking them seemed like a battle. He couldn't afford the new, more expensive doses, and he didn't know how much longer he could manage to scrape together enough money for the next refill. He stumbled into the kitchen to make coffee, his mind foggy from lack of sleep. The usual morning routine had lost its comfort. As the coffee brewed, John looked out the window at the empty street outside. He was supposed to be looking forward to his retirement, to the days where he could relax and maybe do some traveling or pick up an old hobby. But instead, he felt like every decision he made was a gamble, and the stakes kept rising. John knew he needed to go to the doctor for his routine checkup, but he kept putting it off. It wasn't just because of the cost, it was the dread of being told his condition had worsened. What if the doctor told him he couldn't take his heart medications at all unless he forked over a ridiculous amount of money for some new treatment plan? What if his heart was deteriorating faster than he realized? The thought made him nauseous, but the reality was worse. On top of all that, he had started to notice that his physical health was more fragile than ever. His legs felt weak as he walked, and he often found himself short of breath after doing the smallest tasks, like taking out the trash or walking up the stairs. He had always been a man of action, used to working with his hands and staying active, but now, every step felt like a challenge. He picked up his phone and stared at it for a long moment, then dialed his doctor's office, already dreading the conversation. It wasn't the first time he'd called, but this time, he felt as if the burden was heavier than ever. The receptionist answered in her usual robotic tone. "Good morning, this is Grace from Dr. Miller's office. How can I help you today?" "Hi, Grace. It's John Matthews. I need to schedule a checkup. I've been feeling off lately." Grace's response was efficient, almost practiced. "Sure, Mr. Matthews. Let me check the schedule for you." There was a short pause before she added, "The earliest we can get you in is next week. Does that work for you?" John knew that any delay in care could be dangerous. "Next week? I don't know if I can wait that long. My condition's been worsening," and she cut him off, the calmness in her voice unshaken. "I understand, but that's the soonest we can do. If you're experiencing severe symptoms, you should go to the ER." John felt the blood drain from his face. "The ER? I can't afford that. I'm already behind on my bills, and the last thing I need is another huge medical bill to pile up on me. I'm sorry, Mr. Matthews, but we can't get you in any sooner. If your symptoms get worse, the ER is the best option." John ended the call feeling more deflated than ever. The healthcare system, once a safety net, now felt like a trap. He didn't know what else to do. He couldn't wait another week for help, but what choice did he have? As the days dragged on, John's body and mind continued to wear down. He was becoming a shadow of the man he once was, both physically and mentally. The pressure of dealing with skyrocketing costs, deteriorating health, and mounting debts was breaking him down bit by bit. He had always prided himself on being self-sufficient, a man who could handle anything life threw at him. But now, it felt like everything was crumbling, and no matter how hard he tried, there was no way out. One morning, while sitting at the kitchen table, John decided to take a closer look at the stack of unopened medical bills that had accumulated over the past few weeks. With a sigh, he began sorting through them. They were all labeled urgent in bold letters, and as he glanced over the amounts due, his heart sank further. There were the prescriptions, which were now 4 times what he had paid just a few months ago. There was the hospital bill from his last visit. There was the overdue notice for the rent. And, to top it off, there was a letter from the power company threatening to disconnect his service if he didn't pay up by the end of the month. John sat there in silence, feeling the weight of the world on his shoulders. His heart was still beating, but for how much longer? He didn't know. And as much as he tried to find a way out of this financial nightmare, he couldn't shake the feeling that he was being swallowed whole by forces beyond his control. The choice, once again, seemed impossible. Keep paying for his meds and risk everything else, or let his health decline and watch his life fall apart. John knew one thing for sure: whatever decision he made next, it was going to change everything. John woke up to the sound of his alarm ringing in the stillness of the morning, a reminder that another day had begun, and with it, the same relentless cycle of worries and obligations. He lay in bed for a few minutes, staring at the ceiling, the weight of everything bearing down on him. The uncertainty of his health, the rising cost of his medications, the looming rent payment, and the unrelenting pressure of bills, every thought seemed to swirl around in his mind like a storm that wouldn't subside. He knew he couldn't keep pretending that everything would be fine, that things would somehow work out on their own. He had tried to convince himself of that for too long. It was only now, in the cold light of day, that he fully realized how fragile his situation had become. John dragged himself out of bed, his body feeling heavier than usual. His legs ached, his chest felt tight, and he was exhausted. The shortness of breath he had been experiencing over the past few weeks seemed to be getting worse. He had always been an active person, but now even the simplest tasks left him winded and struggling. He shuffled to the bathroom and looked at his reflection in the mirror, trying to muster the energy to get through the day. His face looked older than it should, more worn, more drawn. There was a hollow look in his eyes, a reflection of the toll that stress, worry, and illness had taken on him. His heart condition, once a manageable problem, now felt like an anchor dragging him under. After splashing water on his face, John grabbed his bottle of pills from the counter, the familiar routine both comforting and terrifying. He reached for the heart medication that had been keeping him going, but for the first time in a long while, he hesitated. He glanced at the price label, the new, higher price, wondering how much longer he could keep up with this. Was it worth it? Would these medications even be enough to keep him alive if his health continued to deteriorate? With a deep breath, John took the pill, the bitterness in his mouth lingering longer than it should. He could feel the weight of the decision, each pill representing not just a step toward keeping his heart beating, but a step deeper into a cycle of financial uncertainty. The next hour passed in a blur of routine: shower, breakfast, checking his phone for any emails or calls he might have missed. The silence in his apartment was deafening. Even the walls seemed to be closing in on him. His thoughts kept drifting to the bills stacked on the kitchen table, the unopened medical statements that now felt like ticking time bombs. Each letter, each number, each overdue notice, everything was a reminder that his life was slipping out of his control. As John sat down at the kitchen table with his coffee, the phone rang. He stared at the number on the screen, unsure whether to answer. It was the landlord's office. He knew what that meant. He had already fallen behind on rent, and the landlord had been patient, but how much longer could they wait? The thought of being evicted, of losing his home, was too much to bear. His heart started racing, and he could feel the familiar anxiety rising in his chest. Taking another deep breath, John picked up the phone. "Hello?" he said, trying to keep his voice steady. Mr. Matthews, this is Sandra from the landlord's office," came the voice on the other end. "We just wanted to check in on your payment. We've given you several extensions, but the rent is now 2 weeks overdue. You need to make a payment, or we'll have to proceed with eviction proceedings." John's stomach twisted. "I'm doing the best I can," he said, his voice faltering. I'm waiting for a check to come through, and I'll have the money for you soon. Please, just a little more time." Sandra's voice was sympathetic but firm. "I'm sorry, Mr. Matthews, but we can't keep waiting. You've been a good tenant, but we can't afford to let this slide any longer. We'll give you until the end of the week, but after that, we'll have to take legal action." John's mind raced. End of the week. He had no way of making that deadline, not with everything else he was juggling. He needed that check to arrive, and fast. But what if it didn't? What if he couldn't catch up in time? The weight of his responsibilities, his mounting debt, and his failing health all seemed to be closing in on him. The walls of his apartment, once a safe space, now felt like a prison. "Okay," John said, his voice barely above a whisper. "I understand. Thank you." He hung up, staring at the phone for a long moment, his hands shaking. He felt as if the ground was slipping away beneath him. What was he supposed to do now? Where could he turn for help? And most importantly, how much longer could he keep pretending that everything was going to be okay? John glanced at his medication bottles once more, the realization hitting him with full force: his survival, his health, his ability to keep his home, everything was hanging by a thread. And the thread was starting to fray. As the day wore on, John couldn't shake the feeling that he was trapped. No matter how much he tried to keep his head above water, it seemed that everything was slowly dragging him under. The fear of not making it through another month, of losing not just his home, but his dignity, was overwhelming. He had no solutions, no plan. All he had was the grim knowledge that things were getting worse, and there didn't seem to be any way out. John woke up with a heavy heart the morning after the phone call with his landlord. The air in his apartment felt thick, almost suffocating. Every little noise, every thought, seemed magnified. He tried to shake off the sense of impending doom that had settled over him like a storm cloud, but it refused to go away. The deadline to pay the rent was fast approaching, and the mounting medical bills, overdue utility bills, and the ever-growing list of things he couldn't afford were all taking a toll on him, physically and mentally. He sat up in bed, the same old familiar pain in his chest, nothing unusual, but enough to remind him that his body was betraying him, too. The tightness had become more persistent lately. A nagging presence that wouldn't go away. Even his heart, it seemed, was fed up with everything. John had long known that the pills wouldn't solve everything, but he hadn't imagined it would feel like this, as if everything was falling apart in slow motion. He walked to the kitchen, his footsteps slow and deliberate, as though every step took a little more energy than it should. He glanced at the pile of unopened bills sitting on the counter. It felt like a mountain of obligations, each one more overwhelming than the last. And yet, no matter how many times he looked at them, he couldn't find the courage to open them. It was easier to pretend they didn't exist, even though the reality was far too loud to ignore. He poured himself a cup of coffee and sat down at the table. His hands were shaky, the cup nearly slipping from his grasp. It wasn't just the stress, it was the weight of knowing that soon he would be forced to make a choice. A choice he had been avoiding for weeks. The knock on his door came at exactly 11 a.m., like clockwork. John had been expecting it. It was the landlord again, Mr. Matthews. The landlord's voice was firm but not unkind. "I'm afraid we really can't give you any more time. The rent is now a month overdue, and as we discussed, we'll have to proceed with the eviction process if we don't receive payment today." John looked at the man standing in his doorway, his face a mask of professionalism. There was no room for sympathy here, no acknowledgement of the years John had spent as a tenant. "Just business, I understand," John replied, his voice low. He felt like a man on the edge of a cliff. I'm doing everything I can. But it's just not enough." The landlord stood there for a moment, waiting for John to say something more, but when he didn't, he simply nodded. "I'll be in touch about the next steps, Mr. Matthews. You have until the end of today to make a payment." John nodded back, but he couldn't bring himself to say anything else. The door clicked shut behind the landlord, and for a long moment, John just stood there, staring at the floor, the weight of everything pressing down on him once again. He could feel the walls closing in. The reality was clear: he had two choices. One, he could ask Megan for more money, drag her deeper into his financial mess, and possibly lose his pride for good. Two, he could just give up. He could walk away from the apartment, leave behind the rent, the bills, and everything else. Start over, somewhere new, where he didn't have to face the constant pressure of a system that seemed designed to crush people like him. But what would that mean? Giving up his home? His independence? John's mind raced. The eviction would ruin his credit, of course. The thought of starting over in his 50s, with health problems and no safety net, was enough to make him want to crawl under his bed and never come out. He could hardly breathe thinking about it, but then, a thought occurred to him, a desperate one. What if he didn't have to make this decision alone? What if there was a way to fight back, to push back against this system that had made his life so unbearable? He picked up the phone and dialed a number he had avoided for weeks, his daughter's. "Hey, Megan, it's Dad," he said when she picked up. "Listen, I need to ask for your help again. But this time, it's different. It's not just the rent. I need a way out of this whole mess, Megan. I don't know how much longer I can keep doing this." Megan's voice on the other end was calm but firm. "Dad, what are you saying? You're not asking for more money again, are you?" John hesitated. "No, I'm not asking for money, but I need something. I need advice. I don't know what else to do. Should I leave the apartment? Should I just pack up and start over somewhere else? What's the best option for me?" There was a pause before Megan spoke, her voice quiet. "Dad, listen, I know this is hard. But starting over won't fix the real problem. You're not just struggling with rent. You're struggling with your health, your medications, everything. I think you need to face this head on. I know it feels impossible, but maybe we should look into getting some help from a financial advisor, or maybe even a lawyer. Don't give up yet." John sat back in his chair, the weight of her words sinking in. A financial advisor? A lawyer? Those weren't options he had considered before, but Megan was right. Giving up wouldn't fix anything. If anything, it would make things worse. He had fought too long and too hard to throw it all away now. "I'll look into it," John said, a small spark of determination in his voice. "Thank you, Megan. I'll figure this out." As he hung up the phone, John felt the weight on his chest lighten, just a little. Maybe he wasn't completely alone in this fight after all. Maybe there was still a way to pull himself out of this mess, one step at a time. For the first time in weeks, John felt like he might just be able to face the next day.